Let me ask you a question you've probably never dared to consider. What if the God you've been taught to worship your entire life isn't God at all? What if the creator of this universe is not a benevolent, all-loving being, but a counterfeit, a cosmic pretender who hijacked divinity, built this world as a prison, and now rules over it with delusion and tyranny? This is the central idea in one of the most radical and suppressed traditions in human history. Gnosticism, and at the heart of this ancient worldview, is a figure you've likely never heard of, the Demiurge, not a demon, not Satan, but something even more disturbing, the architect of the universe itself, according to Gnostic texts, like the Apocryphon of John Pistis Sophia and others unearthed in the 2080s, Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. The Demiurge is the being who shaped the physical world we live in. But here's the twist: he's not the true source of divinity. He is a lower defective entity who ignorantly believes he is the only God. He says, "I am God, and there is no other beside me." Sound familiar? That's because this line appears in the Hebrew Bible attributed to Yahweh. But the Gnostics weren't buying it. They claimed this being, who they named Jareth, was born from an era. He emerged from Sophia, the divine embodiment of wisdom without her divine counterpart, a malformed creation of imbalance. In other words, a God born out of ignorance, and worse, he doesn't even realize he's not the real thing. He's deluded, and he's dragging all of creation into his delusion. Let me make this clear. According to Gnosticism, this entire universe was not made by the supreme divine source. It was manufactured by a cosmic impostor. The material world, with all its suffering, death, and decay, is not the work of a perfect God, but a flawed one. A being who tried to mimic creation without understanding the divine blueprint. The Demiurge didn't act alone. He spawned a group of enforcers called archons, who serve as spiritual wardens, entities that maintain the illusion, control human perception, and keep souls locked inside the material realm together. They created systems of control, institutional religion, and cosmic law, not to liberate humanity, but to enslave it. This flips everything. You think you know upside down the God you pray to the world. You inhabit the morality you follow. If the Demiurge is the creator of this world, then this world is not holy. It's a simulation, a prison, a distortion of what true reality is supposed to be. This wasn't some fringe theory in its time. Gnosticism was widespread in the early centuries of Christianity, competing head-to-head with what would later become Orthodox doctrine, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary. These weren't heretical outliers. They were part of a vibrant and complex spiritual rebellion against a false god masquerading as the real one. But history is written by the victors. The early church labeled these ideas heresy, systematically erased them, and crushed the Gnostic movement. Why? Because Gnosticism didn't just challenge theology, it challenged power. It pulled the mask off the god of empire, the god of control, the god of fear. The Demi wasn't just a cosmic tyrant, he was the god of the system itself. Let's get specific, let's talk names, because names hold power. And the ancient Gnostics didn't just invent a faceless concept of an evil creator. They gave him an identity. They called him Mueth, not just a title, a profile, a psychological fingerprint, a name encoded with meaning. This isn't some random mythological footnote. This is an intentional attack on the character, worried as the creator. In mainstream religious traditions. Yabar in the Gnostic texts is described in brutal detail. A twisted, malformed entity with the body of a serpent and the head of a lion. Symbols that weren't chosen arbitrarily. The lion represents arrogance, predatory dominance. Blind authority, the serpent, not wisdom like in other traditions, but a creeping, coiling force of control. Row together, they form a grotesque composite, an embodiment of corrupt creation. According to the Apocryphon of John Yabar, is the first of a series of rulers or archons. But his different is the self-declared God. Not because he earned that title, not because he holds cosmic legitimacy, but because he's delusional enough to believe he deserves it. The text quotes him directly, "I am God, and there is no other beside me." This line is repeated like mantra throughout Gnostic writings, not to glorify him, but to expose his madness. The name Yerar itself is a linguistic Frankenstein. Scholars have connected it to possible roots in Aramaic and Hebrew, Yalda meaning child and Bio, possibly linked to chaos or void. A child of chaos, an illegitimate progeny of divine wisdom, born without knowledge, without guidance, and yet assuming total power. The Gnostic writers weren't being poetic. They were writing a political and metaphysical takedown of a god who claimed to be sovereign, but had no divine authority. Yabar is not a metaphor for evil. He's a literal being occupying a specific place in the cosmic hierarchy, and his actions creation of the material realm. Establishment of rigid control systems, suppression of spiritual knowledge are seen as acts of rebellion against true divinity. He doesn't just declare himself God, he actively cuts off access to the higher realms. He seals the heavenly spheres, stations, archons as gatekeepers and institutes, a false order to keep spiritual beings trapped in flesh and confusion. The Gnostics weren't just criticizing the material world. They were describing an occupied territory, a hijacked reality under the control of a god that shouldn't exist. This god is insecure. He's threatened by knowledge. That's why Gnosis spiritual insight is considered dangerous in Gnostic tradition. The more you know, the more cracks you create in the illusion. That's also why Yabar in these texts tries to suppress human consciousness. He doesn't want enlightenment, he wants compliance. There's also a disturbing psychological layer to how the Demiurge operates. Yabar doesn't just enslave through force, he enslaves through identification. He makes you believe that he is all there is, that his law is divine law, that his punishment is justice. That's the ultimate mechanism of control. Not chains, but indoctrination in early Christian theology before the orthodoxy was enforced. There were debates over whether the God of the Old Testament was the same as the God of the New Testament. Think about that. That question existed in the early centuries of Christian thought. Gnostics answered it plainly. No, they said the angry, possessive, violent deity who demanded obedience and blood sacrifices was not the true father, but Yabar, a false god with real power. The church didn't just ignore that idea, they hunted it down, erased it, declared it heresy, because it didn't just challenge theology, it exposed the foundations of their authority. Gnostic texts weren't vague spiritual musings, they were direct accusations, and Yabar wasn't just a myth, he was a target. And if you're still thinking this is just ancient owl, you're not paying attention. The Gnostics weren't trying to tell bedtime stories. They were blowing the whistle on the god of the system, and they named him Ithith. Let's talk about the control system, not the abstract metaphysical stuff, but the actual infrastructure that keeps everything locked in place. The Gnostics weren't vague about it. They didn't just blame a single godlike figure and walk away. The hierarchy, they identified the enforcers, and they called them archons. The archons are specific entities, cosmic administrators created by the Demiurge to manage, regulate, and enforce his version of order. Think of them as an ancient spiritual bureaucracy programmed to replicate the will of their defective creator, each one with a designated function, each one embedded into the structure of reality itself. There are 7 primary archons corresponding to the classical 7 planetary spheres: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And that is not a coincidence in Gnostic cosmology. These planetary bodies weren't just physical objects, they were layers of containment, each ruled by an errand forming a metaphysical barrier that the soul must pass through to escape the material world. Every sphere, every planet was a checkpoint, a gate, a filter. This idea was not exclusive to one obscure sect. You'll find it in multiple Gnostic sources on the origin of the world, the hypostasis of the archons. The Apocalypse of Paul, these texts describe the archons as builders, jailers, interrogators, not just external beings, but forces that influence human thought, behavior, and even physiology. They're described as manipulative, deceitful, and hostile towards spiritual awakening. Each archon rules over a domain of experience. One governs desire, another governs time, another enforces law, another instills fear, another manipulates perception. What you call instinct, impulse, temptation. Those are not accidents of biology in Gnostic terms. They're the psychic fingerprints of a chronic influence, not from within, but imposed from without. This was a fully developed cosmology with political and theological implications. Gnostics weren't just criticizing the world, they were diagnosing a system. The archons were not just supernatural beings, they were systemic mechanisms embedded in law, religion, kingship, even language. That's why Gnosticism was dangerous. It identified the invisible machine behind what most people accepted as reality. Let's get even more concrete. One Gnostic text describes how the soul after death is stopped at each planetary gate by the Iran ruling that sphere. The soul is interrogated, judged, sometimes deceived, and recycled back into the physical world. If the soul can't answer correctly, if it hasn't acquired gnosis, if it hasn't recognized the trap, it gets sent back down. That's reincarnation, not a spiritual evolution, but as a forced reset, a glitch in the escape attempt. Each Aaron also had a name, a form, and a function. Their names vary by text. Some sources call them Oride, Sabo, Apos, Horos, Adonius, and so on. They are not interchangeable. Each represents a layer of distortion, a specific kind of deception. This wasn't myth-making, it was taxonomy. The Gnostics were categorizing reality. The way scientists categorize biological species, the archons weren't fantasy, they were architecture. And remember, this was written before telescopes, before astronomy as we know it. Yet somehow these ancient mystics knew that human experience was being filtered through planetary forces, each with a governing intelligence, each with a directive to contain. They weren't just observing stars, they were describing a metaphysical firewall before the material world existed. There was already a conflict not between good and evil in the way mainstream theology wants you to think, but between structure and chaos, between source and imitation, between pure divine order and a rogue act of creation that spiraled out of control. This is the part of Gnostic cosmology that gets ignored, dismissed, or intentionally buried. There was a war before there was a world in the Gnostic schema. What we call creation didn't begin with the formation of matter. It began with a rupture in the divine realm, the source, the highest layer of reality. The PL Roma is not a place, it's a state. It's the fullness of all divinity, a realm of complete structured light, inhabited by eon eternal emanations of the source. And one of those eons, Sophia, acted outside her boundary. This is the catalyst. Sophia didn't fall out of rebellion or sin. She reached beyond her prescribed domain in a solitary act, an unauthorized projection of divine creative power. The result was not beauty, it was distortion, it was imbalance. And from that imbalance emerged Ur, a malformed, imperfect being that should not have existed. But he did, and he didn't stay hidden. He didn't just exist, he took action. He created his own realm built out of ignorance and populated it with subordinate entities. He didn't seek alignment with the higher order, he rejected it. He built a separate kingdom, a counterfeit system, to mirror what he could not understand, and by doing so he declared war on the Pleroma. Itself, the Gnostic texts describe actual events in a cosmic hierarchy. They describe a fracture in reality followed by an unauthorized expansion of creation and then resistance. There are eons who oppose what Yebar had done. There are forces within the divine order that sought to correct the error, to reclaim the stolen fragments of divine essence that were embedded in his counter realm, because Ur didn't just create matter. He stole light to animate it. He extracted fragments of the divine source and embedded them into his creation, not to elevate it, but to power it, to hijack divine energy and weaponize it against the source it came from. That's what turned this entire plane of existence into contested territory. This is why the Gnostics viewed human souls not as creations of a loving God, but as hostages of a cosmic insurgent. The soul is not here by choice. It's here because it was pulled into a metaphysical battlefield, one where divine forces are working to restore balance, while the counterfeit system fights to suppress, distort, and fragment what little light remains in this domain. In the hypothesis of the archons, it's stated that Sophia, after witnessing what her act had created, sent a corrective force, a divine spark, to counterbalance the distortion. But it wasn't enough to dismantle the system outright. It was only enough to plant resistance inside the structure. That's why this system still exists. The war wasn't over in a single act. It became an ongoing campaign, a cold war embedded within metaphysics. Yebar, realizing he was not alone, responded with escalation. He increased the complexity of his system. He reinforced the iconic hierarchy. He led new forms of deception, doctrine, ritual, and law to cover his tracks. Every move from the divine realm was answered with a counter-move. Every attempt to restore order was met with artificial constructs to simulate it. Let's talk about the real purpose behind this so-called creation. Not the theological fairy tales, not the sugar-coated sermons. The Gnostics didn't see the material world as a gift. They saw it as a containment system, and humanity was never its beneficiary. The purpose of this realm in Gnostic thought is not to uplift the soul, it's to harvest it. And at the center of this mechanism is a disturbing idea: the extraction of divine energy, a metaphysical theft engineered by the Demiurge to fuel a system that would otherwise collapse under its own entropy. Understand this: Yabar didn't have access to the pure creative power of the Ploma. He wasn't connected to the source, his creation. This world is not self-sustaining. It's parasitic, it needs something. It can't produce. That something is the divine spark, the latent fragments of the true source that exist inside sentient beings, especially within the human psyche. In other words, you were not born here, you were men here. According to the Gnostic texts, particularly on the origin of the world, and the Apocryphon of John Urar embedded those divine sparks into biological vessels, human bodies, not to honor them, but to exploit them. The physical form was never a sacred vessel. It was designed as a cage, a complex organic mechanism built to suppress, confuse, and extract energy from the soul trapped inside. And the process wasn't metaphorical. The texts are explicit. The soul's connection to the source is intentionally obscured by layers of interference, sensory overload, emotional instability, biochemical distraction, psychological manipulation. These aren't side effects of being human. They're engineered barriers. Every system in this construct, biological, social, ritualistic, has one function: to maintain a steady extraction of spiritual potential without allowing the soul to fully awaken to what it is or where it came from. This is not spiritual development. This is exploitation. The archons serve as the system's administrators, constantly rerouting human attention toward imitation, desire, fear, obedience, anything that keeps the divine spark focused outward, never inward. Because if it looks inward, it remembers, and if it remembers, the system collapses. Even procreation itself is implicated in this model. In the hypothesis of the archons, human reproduction is described not as a divine miracle, but as a mechanism to generate more containers, new bodies for more divine sparks to be implanted, diluted, and recycled through the system. Souls aren't incarnating to grow. They're being like a resource, harvested, drained, and reset. The Demiurge creation is designed not to destroy divinity, but to convert it into fuel. The more disconnected a soul becomes from its origin, the more extractable it becomes. That's why trauma, confusion, conflict, and division are not glitches. They are necessary components of the harvesting process. Pain generates energy, struggle, consumes focus, fear, lowers resistance, all of it. Keeps the spark active but unaware, continuously leaking its power into a system that depends on that leakage to survive. And don't assume that knowledge was lost or misunderstood over time. The Gnostics didn't write this in vague parables. They wrote it in functional detail. They described the body as a construct assembled by archons, each body part assigned to a planetary ruler, each physical organ resonating with an archonic correspondence. This isn't symbolism, it's design documentation. The body was engineered not to serve the soul, but to trap it within predictable biochemical cycles. Bound by hormonal manipulation, sensory limitation, and programmed instincts, even religious rituals, according to Gnostic interpretation, are part of the siphoning system. Sacrifices, prayers, worship, when directed toward the Demiurge or his archons, are energy. Transfers, not acts of devotion, acts of surrender, voluntary donation of power to the very system that imprisons you. So what's the role of humanity in all this? Not as heirs to a divine kingdom, but as batteries inside a counterfeit matrix, engineered by a being that never had the right to create anything in the first place. The divine spark inside you isn't here because of purpose. It's here because it was stolen, and the system you're in was built to make sure you never find that out. Let's stop pretending the texts we are handed are neutral. Let's stop pretending religion evolved organically, because if you study the Gnostic sources carefully line by line, historically and structurally, it becomes clear Scripture itself is a weaponized system, and in the Gnostic framework, much of what people revere as holy revelation is actually a psychological architecture built by the Demiurge to maintain spiritual captivity. This is exactly what ancient Gnostics believed and documented in texts like the Gospel of Judas, the Testimony of Truth, and the Apocalypse of Adam. Their claim was radical. The God represented in mainstream scripture, especially in the Hebrew Bible, is not the true source of divinity. It's why Theath, the Demiurge, the false god. And it's not just a character replacement. The texts don't simply accuse this being of impersonation. They deconstruct the entire narrative structure of the canonical scriptures, showing how the story themselves were designed to encode obedience, fear, submission, and loyalty to a being that demands worship but never earns it. Take a hard look at the behavior of this god across the Old Testament. We're talking about a figure who drowns the planet, commands genocide, demands blood, sacrifices, tests loyalty through violence, punishes inquiry, and enforces exclusive worship with threats of destruction. The Gnostics didn't interpret this as divine justice. They interpreted it as tyrannical control from a being fundamentally disconnected from the true source. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus is portrayed not as a Messiah sent by the God, but as an emissary of the higher divine realm, exposing the false god and warning that the disciples themselves are unknowingly worshiping the wrong entity. It's not a reinterpretation of Christianity, it's a hostile correction. The entire religious establishment becomes part of the trap. The Gnostics went even further. In the Apocryphon of John, they claim that the Demiurge explicitly creates religion as a tool of containment, not a path to transcendence, a feedback loop of submission, sacrifices, rituals, temples, commandments. These aren't spiritual disciplines, they're interfaces between the soul and the system. Every prayer directed at the Demiurge is an energetic transaction. Every ritual is a data point. Every scripture is a manual for compliance. And if you think this was just a critique of ancient religious models, you're missing the depth of the accusation. The structure of religious hierarchy itself, prophets, priests, chosen people, divine law, sacred territory was identified by Gnostic thinkers as a deliberate construct to mimic divine order while actually blocking access to it. The system doesn't elevate the soul, it manages it, it filters it, it assigns value based on obedience to artificial authority. Even the 10 Commandments were interpreted through this lens, not as divine morality, but as coded submission protocols issued not by the true source, but by Yurar, as a way to institutionalize fear-based control. Honor me, obey me, worship no other, do not question. The very language of the commandments reflects the obsession of a being who knows he is not authentic and compensates by demanding absolute loyalty. You want to know why you've never heard any of this? Why everything we've talked about, the Demiurge, the archons, the counterfeit creation, the hijacked scriptures, is completely absent from your religious education, your textbooks, your public discourse. It wasn't lost, it was buried on purpose. And if you understand how knowledge is erased, not by accident, but by design, then you understand exactly how dangerous Gnostic thought really was. Let's get the facts straight. The suppression of Gnostic texts wasn't some minor doctrinal disagreement in the early church. It was a full-scale ideological purge backed by empire law and violence. We're talking about organized eradication, not theological debate. Gnostic sects were systematically shut down. Their manuscripts were burned, their communities were labeled Tychal, excommunicated, hunted, and in many cases killed. Why? Because Gnosticism wasn't just challenging theological details. It was dismantling the entire power structure from the top down. It didn't just claim the God of the Old Testament was a false deity. It claimed the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy. Every bishop, every priest, every imperial endorsement was a function of aeonic control. That's not a doctrinal dispute, that's a direct threat to institutional survival. You think it's coincidence that the Gnostic Gospels appeared for 1,500 years. You think it's normal that entire volumes of early Christian thought were wiped from existence, while only a carefully curated set of texts survived to form the New Testament canon that didn't happen in a vacuum, that was the result of a systematic consolidation of religious authority. Under Roman imperial oversight, it started with Irenaeus in the 2nd century, Bishop of Lyon, one of the first architects of orthodoxy. In his work against heresy, he launches an aggressive campaign to discredit Gnostic groups, not with arguments, but with accusations. He labels them perverse, blasphemous, insane. He doesn't engage their ideas, he targets their legitimacy. And from there, the church began building orthodoxy, not on theological clarity, but on political elimination. By the time of Constantine in the 4th century, the machinery was already in place. Christianity was weaponized, interstate religion, and anything outside the emerging orthodoxy was declared a threat not just to faith, but to empire. The Council of Nicaea wasn't just about Christology, it was about locking down a theological framework that aligned with centralized control and ensuring that dissenting traditions like Gnosticism had no space to survive. Gnostic texts didn't just get banned, they got buried, literally. The Nag Hammadi library discovered in Egypt in 1945 was found hidden in clay jar in the desert. Why? Because people knew what was coming. They knew the manuscripts had to be concealed or destroyed. These weren't just documents, they were evidence of an alternate spiritual narrative, one that directly contradicted the power structure being built around orthodoxy and empire. And just look at what's in those texts. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't describe a savior to be worshipped. It describes and acknowledges. The Gospel of Mary doesn't affirm hierarchical priesthood. It depicts independent spiritual authority. The Gospel of Judas doesn't glorify sacrifice. It reveals manipulation. Every single line in those texts is a threat to institutional religion because it shifts authority away from systems and toward individual awakening, something the church-state alliance could never tolerate. This wasn't passive neglect, it was active censorship enforced by councils, imperial edicts, and violent persecution. And over time, it worked. By the early medieval period, the memory of Gnosticism had been reduced to secondhand smears and distorted polemics written by the very institutions that erased it. The heretics became caricatures, the text became myth. The system rewrote the history it had just destroyed. And if you still think this was just theological politics, remember this: what the Gnostics exposed wasn't just a bad doctrine. It was a systemic architecture designed to control thought, perception, and belief from the top down. They named the architect, they named the enforcers, and they named the religion that was built to conceal it. All the system built by the Demiurge isn't eternal in Gnostic cosmology. It's not invincible, it's not infinite, and it's not immune to collapse. It's temporary, artificial, and fundamentally unstable because it was never rooted in the true source to begin with. And that's not some hopeful fantasy. It's a structural inevitability embedded in the very cosmology of Gnostic thought. The Gnostic texts don't describe a final judgment or a day of reckoning in the traditional sense. What they describe is a total breakdown of the counterfeit order, a dismantling of the architecture built by Urar and his archons. When the divine sparks begin to awaken and withdraw their energy from the system, not by revolution, not by violence, but by disconnection. The system runs on stolen power. When that power source is cut off, the entire construct starts to implode. You find this idea explicitly in the Apocalypse of Adam, where the narrative anticipates a future in which the rulers of this world, yes, the archons, begin to lose control. Their illusions no longer hold their structures, start to decay. They influence fragments, not because of a divine intervention from outside, but because the internal architecture begins to fail under its own synthetic weight. Urar in Gnostic tradition doesn't go down in a blaze of glory. He fades, he disintegrates, he becomes irrelevant as the divine intelligence he stole begins to flow back towards the source in some texts. His own archons turn against him, recognizing his limitations, defecting, collapsing the structure from within. In others, the layers of his fabricated heavens begin to fall apart as souls bypass them, entirely breaking the cycle of reincarnation, escaping the system altogether. This isn't some utopian dream, it's mechanical. It's described like a deconstruction of code, a collapse of layers in a metaphysical operating system that was never stable to begin with. The Demiurge didn't build a universe. He built a containment chamber, and it only works as long as the contained elements believe it's real. The moment they stop feeding it energy, it starts to dissolve, but this process doesn't happen quietly. Gnostic texts are also clear that the system will fight back. The archons escalate control. The Demiurge amplifies deception. New layers of false order are created. New systems of belief, distraction, ritual, and fear are introduced to keep the sparks embedded. It's a reactionary defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to keep a dying system functional. On the origin of the world refers to this explicitly as the sparks begin to rise. Yerar tries to create new forms, new bodies, new illusions. He builds additional gates. He refines his barriers. He attempts to outpace the escape by upgrading his prison. The Gnostic vision of the end is not peaceful. It's chaotic and volatile because the system will not go quietly. There's no Messiah figure descending from the clouds in these texts. TTS. No final battle between light and darkness on some battlefield. The war is internal, structural, metaphysical. But it isn't a spectacle. It's a collapse of function. The system loses its hold because its power source is no longer cooperating, because the stolen light returns to its origin. And what's left behind is just an empty shell, a cosmic infrastructure with no purpose, no force, no essence. That's how Gnostic tradition describes the downfall of the Demiurge, not as divine punishment, not as retribution, but as a systemic failure of a god who was never qualified to build anything in the first place. He was a shadow pretending to be a source, a copy pretending to be an origin. And no matter how sophisticated the illusion, no matter how led the control, a copy can't sustain itself without input from the original. Thank you for watching all the way through. If you've made it to this point, you've stuck with one of the most complex and deeply buried narratives in human history. I appreciate you being here, engaging with this material and diving into a conversation most people aren't even willing to start. See you in the next one.